All right. Well, here we are at 11 o'clock, right? And we have a special treat today for our CPP is Dr. Mathias Nordvig. Right? Now, a little background. Matthias, he's an instructor at the CU Nordic program. And he teaches things about like pre-Christian Nordic mythology, Scandinavian folklore, Nordic memory studies, myth and disaster studies, North Atlantic and Greenlandic culture, and things about the Viking Age. I mean, some really interesting stuff. Now, I met Matthias some time ago, a couple years ago, because I was trying to put together this big sort of online specialization for Coursera on sort of the Arctic. And, part of what I wanted to do was try to get at some of these cultural issues and things like that. And so we met up with Matthias, in part because of that, but in part also because in the Department of Geography now we have a certificate in Arctic studies, right? And there are a number of required courses and electives. And this certificate should involve sort of issues of the physical aspects of the Arctic, but also some of the cultural aspects. So I found Matthias and we started talking about this, and we realized that we have all these mutual interests and that we at NSIDC certainly could benefit from a lot of these different insights. So that's kind of our background on all of this stuff. So what we have today is Matthias is going to tell us about the cultural history of Greenland, why it matters to modern geopolitics. So very much polar regions, right? Very much cryosphere, really, Greenland, but just a different perspective on things that maybe we haven't heard much about. So with that, Matthias, I will let you go and take it away.
Thank you so much, Mark. Yeah, a little addendum to me as a person. I grew up as a child in Greenland, or what we call Kalaallit in the Western Greenlandic dialect. I am originally from Denmark, the country that currently owns Greenland as a landmass. I am, in that sense, sort of like culturally mixed, not ethnically mixed, though. I'm fully ethnically Danish. That's also part of my background and what I'm talking about here. And if you are more interested in the cultural contexts of all of these things, there's a link in this slide that I'll talk about later to my website, where I also blog about some of these subjects in different ways. The most recent one is about the cultural relationship between the Kalaallit and the Danes. But what you're seeing here on this first page of my PowerPoint is, Kalaallit, Greenland. And as you can see, what we have here are the markings of, and just to give you an idea of what I will be going through, I'm assuming that you might not know much about the history or culture of Greenland. So I'm giving you a broad overview of some of the most important aspects of that and the relationship to the Danes. And I have put all my information into the slides so that I will make them available to you in whichever capacity that we can figure out with Ms. Dia. And then you can download the slides and use them for your own benefit if there's anything you want from them. But as we are seeing here, this is an overview of the relationships between the different Arctic peoples. And the Kalaallit, they belong to the Inuit. So they are closely related in both genetically and culturally and linguistically with the Inuits in Nunavut in northern Canada. As you can see, that's what all the blue markings are about. As such, and because their cultural history and general history with Scandinavia, they belong to one of the two indigenous minorities in the Scandinavian realm. In general, the other indigenous minority is the Sami peoples that you can see marked over on the right-hand side of the map in northern Scandinavia. Now, the difference between the Kalaallit and the Sami peoples, for instance, in Norway, is that the Kalaallit do not enjoy indigenous status in the realm of Denmark. They are considered citizens, and the Danish government has done very little to address its colonial history. So that's also part of the background here for the relationship between Kalaallit and the Danes. Moving on from there, we can see a map of Greenland again, and then we have Denmark down there in the corner, just to the southern part of Scandinavia, north of Germany. And as you can see, the size difference is huge, but the population difference is the inverted. Denmark has about the same population size as Colorado, 5.7 million people. Greenland is at 56 or 57,000 people as far as Greenland looks like in comparison with the United States. It's a huge landmass. It takes up 98% of the Danish commonwealth, as we call it. You can see for reference, we have Denmark over there in the corner that sort of, is about the size of Vermont with Connecticut and Rhode Island. So that is just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here. If you're not familiar with the geographical layout of Greenland, Greenland is a massive country with a small population. I'm sure, of course, you're aware of the inland ice that covers most of Greenland. And the way that you get around is by sailing and flying. But to go to the history of Kalaallit Nunaat, we have modern Inuit populating Avanna in the far northern part of Greenland around 1,000 years ago. The Thule Inuit, as they're called, were specialized seal, whale, and polar bear hunters, and they used Sinovac bows, tuggle head harpoons, skin-covered kayak, and boats, that's the big women's boats, and dog sleds and snow goggles. So they were, it was a technologically well-adapted hunting culture that came into the Greenland landmass at the time. They migrated other Inuit from Alaska and then across the northern rim of Canada and Nunavut, and then to Avanna, where they settled in the vicinity of Savissivik and Qaanaaq, which is also known as Thule to Americans and Danes. This is where the US has their military base, one of them. Now, between that time of their early migration to Greenland and then the year 1300, they spread southwards and then came to inhabit the entire landmass of Greenland, except for the northeastern corner that seemingly has never been populated at all. Life before colonization, basically what we have is a traditional culture of living in nuclear families tied together by extended family bonds and sort of more clan-like structures. Communal sharing of the hunt was a given, and there was no formal authority in the traditional settlements, but highly skilled persons and the elderly were, of course, greatly respected. There's always been a very strong respect for the individual in Inuit culture in Kalaallit Nunaat, and therefore also individual autonomy. And this has historically made the Greenlanders inherently reluctant to make decisions on behalf of others when participating in the Danish-imposed democratic process in the 20th century. This has been a contentious subject that, well, nowadays actually is waning a little bit. Because Kalaallit are integrating into the modern democratic framework. Now, Inuit in Greenland traditionally lived in turf houses, but with the Danish presence, we also see wood houses being introduced. Generosity and communal sharing has been and still is an important part of the interhuman relations in different ways. And when it comes to food, seal has always been a foundational part of subsistence and cultural identity in Greenland. What we typically see is people identify with eating, identify their nationality, so to speak, in Galactic with eating seal meat. Seal blubber, boiled seal meat, and seal swasset are popular dishes in Galactic and I'm getting kind of hungry just speaking about them because I grew up with this stuff as well, and it is delicious food. So that's sort of like a cultural staple of Greenland. Now, before the Christian mission, what we have is the Angakok as a religious authority. Now, the Angakok also held some power in the settlements, but they were feared and respected at the same time. And if we want to apply the term, we can say that this is sort of like the local shaman. They would be in control of evil spirits that had the power to rob someone's soul. And just an interesting little factoid here, the typical Inuit word for soul is Inua, which applies both to humans and animals. And Inua is also the root of the word Inuit, which means humans. A person is Inuk, one human. And so traditionally there's very little distinction in terms of like this spiritual distinction between animals and humans in Inuit culture. And this also has implications for how and why and when you hunt. Now, the Angakok would also be able to bring back the soul of somebody whose soul has been taken by counter magic. And all of this relates to different spiritual, religious ways of mitigating illnesses. That's usually how illness is interpreted, as somebody trying to steal your soul, whether it's a evil Angakok or it is some natural spirit, a Tupilak, for instance. So that would be the role of the Angakok. Now, one of the interesting sort of recorded myths that we have that the Angakok would engage with is the shamanistic trance, where the Angakok predicts the future or travels to bring back animals when fluctuations in the population cause scarcity. And this would be a ritual where the Angakok goes into a drum trance, and his spirits then leaves his body and dives into the ocean. And here he visits Sassumaana or Nærvik, depending on which dialect we're speaking in Greenland, at the bottom of the ocean, and he combs her hair. Now, the reason that Sassumaana would hold back animals was that she would be angry that human waste got entangled in her hair, and it was the job of the Angakok then to clean her hair. Now, once her hair was clean and nice and tidy again, then she would release animals. So what we're seeing here is of course, a mythical explanation for the scarcity of animals for the hunt in various contexts, and then religious rituals to mitigate that situation. Then, of course, when you apply that to an Angakok, that means then that the Angakok would also be a very important and powerful individual in the settlements and cultural figure as such. Now, as I mentioned before, the Inua is a term for spirit that is applied both to humans and animals. And what this means is that the world view is centered, or was centered, around this balance between humans and animals. And the hunter was supposed to not put too much strain on the environment, don't overhunt, and make sure to not catch too much in order just to catch enough to sustain life. Another aspect that is involved here also when the hunter hunts is the hunter's own moral or ethical values. These are important in context of hunting because the animals are assumed to be able to basically see and call out if you're a bad person. That means that if you're a good person, then your hunt will be better. This is a theme that we see in a lot of myths and folk tales from Greenland. And this is also a very common theme in other Inuit cultures, where we also sometimes see the idea that if your clothes are sewn in a certain way, then you have more luck in the hunt. The animals will see that you come from a household that is loving and caring, and they will basically want to visit you. That's sort of like the underlying premise here. You invite these animals in by hunting and killing them. And then their spirit will go back again and tell the other animals that they can safely go visit this hunter. So that's the basis on which the hunters interact with animals that they're hunting. And the Angarok is in charge of mitigating this relationship between humans and animals and appeasing the animals if there's something that disrupts this interaction. Now, the last non-Christians in Greenland, they were living on the east coast in Tasiilaq, where we see in 1894 the establishment of the trade post for sealskin, and then we also have a mission developed that those two things go hand in hand in Greenland. And by 1921, what we see is that most, if not all, in Eastern Greenland had converted to Christianity, but still certain elements of the old religion are still in place both there and elsewhere in Greenland. I grew up with a lot of stories, a lot of rituals and traditions that related to this pre-Christian religion in Greenland. So it's still very commonplace, and it's even being, especially now, being revived as a way of regaining identity among Inuit in Greenland. I just want to direct your attention to these pictures that I've put in here. We have a Dupilap, which is sort of like an evil, not always evil, but generally considered an evil spirit in the mountains that you can encounter. And what we have in the right-hand lower corner is a picture of a Angakok who is doing a drum journey. He's tied up here to go on this journey. And obviously, we have a lot of written material descriptions of these rituals left thanks to explorers like Knud Rasmussen that I'll talk about a little later. But getting into the colonization aspects, so life was disrupted very early on, actually, in Greenland by the presence of Europeans, at least in modern times. We see whalers coming in from the 1500s. Then we have expeditions from the Danish Norwegian Empire in the 1600s. In 1605, Christian IV of Denmark sends an expedition to reconnect with the Scandinavians that they believe are still up there, but they find nothing. And then we have the establishment of colonial trade and mission from the 1700s, and I'll get into the details of this. At an early stage, we see Dano-Norwegian colonial traders in the 1700s warning against the decline in health standards, poor maintenance of hunting gear, and also increasing dependence upon colonial trade among Inuit. And this is a result of these enhanced interactions that are happening from the establishment of the colonial trade ports in 1721. But what happens in terms of sort of like a timeline for the colonization of Kalaallit Nunaat? The Danes and Norwegians, as our one empire at the time in the 1700s. And first, what we see is there's the establishment of the Danish colonial rule, a formal Danish colony of Greenland under the Royal Greenland Trade Department from 1721 to 1862. In 1862, we see the establishment of colonial rule with native advisory councils. So Greenland gets one, two, three, I think, two or three in native councils, as they're called, where you have local advisory to the Danish king on what to do with Greenland and how to create policies and so on. From 1911 to 1953, we have Danish colonial rule with elected local and two regional councils. So that's the introduction of democracy in Greenland. It happens a little later than in Denmark. Formal parliamentary democracy in Denmark is established in 1905 after the revision of the Constitution. The Constitution is given already in 1848, but it is not a proper parliamentary constitution. Denmark is still to this day a monarchy. Now, in 1953 and up to 1979, Greenland is incorporated into the Danish nation as a county. Just consider that. It is a municipality, one single municipality that's the size of most of the American Midwest in geographical terms. And that is a Danish attempt to curb the rising backlash against the colonies. And we see in this period, that's where most of the colonies around the world are abolished. And that's thanks to the UN putting pressure on colonial powers to dismantle them and give them independence. Denmark is not particularly happy about this idea, so they just turn Greenland into a county instead. Now, in 79, Greenland receives home rule under Danish provision, and is initially included into the EU along with Denmark. Denmark joins the EU in 72. But Greenland leaves in 87 over fishing rights. That's the main reason that Greenland decides to leave the EU. So Greenland is formally a part of the Danish Commonwealth now, but not a member of the EU. In 2009 and until now, Greenland has had extended home rule with the option to leave the Commonwealth at any time, but it is still under Danish provision in matters of foreign affairs primarily. But the whole, the new treaty has been moved towards what in Danish is called taking home all the different administrative, any administrative task basically that was previously in Copenhagen, Denmark. So today, the population of Greenland numbers around 56,000 with 49,000 native-born Greenlanders. That includes non-indigenous peoples too. Approximately 80% of the population lives in 18 municipal centers, which in most cases have more than 1,000 inhabitants. Nuuk is the capital with approximately 16,000 inhabitants. That might have grown since last time I checked. When I lived there, there was 13,000 inhabitants, as far as I remember. That was back in the late 80s and early 90s. The remaining 20% of the population that does not live in towns lives in approximately 80 smaller settlements and 50 homesteads spread across the coast. Greenland established home rule in 79, as I mentioned, and thus became an independent part of the Danish Commonwealth, which is called Rigsfællesskabet in Danish. And that is along with the Faroe Islands as well, as archipelago in the North Atlantic between Scotland, Norway, and Iceland, for those of you who aren't aware. Now, most Greenlanders today identify as Protestant Lutheran Christians in accordance with the Danish National Church, that's Folkekirken. Denmark does not have formal separation of church and state. We have a people's church that everybody is in principle supposed to be a member of. And that also goes for the population in Greenland. Now, some of the complexities that come with this colonization. There's a prehistory in terms of Scandinavian presence in Greenland before the 1700s that's important to understand too. So in the 970s, what we see is Scandinavian settlers from Iceland establishing themselves in the southern part of Greenland and gave the country the name Greenland. That means Greenland. And the idea was, well, according to Íslendinga a book written in Iceland in the 1100s, Eric the Red, as you're seeing him in a 16th century drawing over here, he did not have that fancy armor. The Vikings have not invented that fancy armor yet. This is a 16th century fiction about him. He reportedly was the first settler to go to Greenland from Iceland, and he called it Greenland, according to Íslendinga book, the Book of Icelanders, because he wanted to attract other settlers. Now, it is actually more likely that the Greenland is called Greenland because the southern tip of Greenland is actually pretty green in the summertime, and this would be the sailing direction that you would be aiming for, because if you just sail due west from the Icelandic Westfjords, Breiðafjörður, in particular where Eric the Red sailed from, then you will just get to rocky beaches and large glaciers. And that's a place, according to the saga literature, that you didn't want to end up at. So it's probably more sailing direction than this myth about wanting to attract other settlers. But in the same around the same time, the Paleo Inuit culture that had inhabited the area prior to the Scandinavian settlement had died out. I think the last thing I've seen about this is that in the 800s, we see the Paleo Inuit cultures that presumably Dorset culture had died out in Greenland. So that means that for both the Scandinavians and the Inuit that are moving into the northern parts of Greenland, the territory is uninhabited. And this means that in principle, the modern designations for Greenland, Galashitin and Greenland, are at the same age. They might actually be the same word. Galashit might have its etymological origins in the Scandinavian designations for Greenland, but this is unclear. It also means that Greenland has been culturally influenced by both Scandinavians and Inuit for the last 1,000 years. And that tells you a little bit about the Scandinavian perspective on this and why the Danish government has not been particularly positively inclined towards ideas of just giving up Greenland, because in principle, a Scandinavian country has claimed ownership over the landmass for 1,000 years. It started with Norway and then turned into Denmark after Denmark and Norway split up in 1814. What you're seeing here are pictures of the two main settlements, Amiralik, and that's also known as Vesturbygd, the western settlement, and then Qasiasuk, which is the Östurbygd, the eastern settlement. A little fun fact about Amiralik, the picture that you're seeing right there is actually where I used to go hunting as a kid. It's about 3-4 hours sailing south of Nuuk. But that whole fjord area behind the Nuuk headland, where Nuuk is today, was settled with scattered farms by Scandinavians in the 970s. So, and now formally, by the way, in the textual material that we have available from Iceland, we are dealing with a 985 as the sort of formal settlement date, but the earliest settlement remains in Greenland in the southern part indicate 970s skeletons, for instance. Okay, so from 970 to 1450, the southern parts of Galashitunat were inhabited by the Greenlanders or Ahlunait, and that's Galashisut for Dane or foreigner. The center was Karlsøy, Qasiasuk, as we're seeing it in the picture on the bottom, where we're seeing the picture of the old stone church in Karlsøy. And that's near modern-day Qaqortoq and Narsaq. But they also inhabited, as I mentioned, Amerlik Fjord. The last communication with them was in 1408, where the Church of Norway registered a wedding in Karlsøy. Now, in the century thereafter, they disappear, and theories on their disappearance range from economic and agricultural decline over inclusion into Inuit populations, and also being victims of Portuguese piracy. There are multiple theories here, and it's hard to actually gauge. The most prevalent theory is environmental decline due to the Little Ice Age, which I personally support. The most recent book on the subject, let's see if I can find it. If you can see the most recent, let's see this, there you go. Most recent investigation is Norse Greenland Viking peasants in the Arctic by a Norwegian historian, Arne Kvidne, who actually purports that the demise of the Scandinavian population in Greenland was due to hostilities and active raiding parties by Inuit. Something that I consider pretty far-fetched based off the evidence that he uses. I've actually written a review of his book in Scandinavian Studies, which would be coming out this last quarter. Yeah, so going on from there, sorry. All factors probably have played a role in their decline, but it is generally interesting to note, aside from what Medvitne claims, that it actually looks like there was peaceful coexistence between the two population groups. Inuits show up around the 1200s on the outer islands in the area of Qasiasuk and Amerlik and the Qaqortoq fjords, and it looks like they generally trade peacefully with the populations that are already in existence there. So, as I mentioned, what we're seeing from the 1500s are whalers coming in, and that means then that the interactions with Europeans shifts to Dutch, English, and Portuguese whalers primarily, some Basque whalers as well, some French ones too, here and there. And from the 1600s, we then have Danish and Norwegian explorations. And these Danish Norwegian explorations are the result of the Danish king trying to reestablish his foothold in Greenland and the North Atlantic in general. Iceland belongs to the Danish king at the time too. And there has been a little bit of ambiguity because of the Danish realm being generally engaged in wars in the European continent. They have neglected the North Atlantic, and the Christian IV attempts to reestablish his foothold in the North Atlantic, and he succeeds. The English have been a little bit too much on the forefront here, and been trying to appropriate trade and such, especially in Iceland at the time. But the Danish king manages to sort of regain dominance in the area, and part of these explorations in the early 1600s are to reconnect with these Scandinavian settlers that they believe are still up there in the Greenlandic area. They don't find any, and what they do find are Inuits, and in several cases we're seeing direct kidnapping of Inuit in different ways. Sometimes they bribe them to come on the ships Sometimes they try to trade with them, and then there's a confusion, and then they take one prisoner. And sometimes they just go for kidnapping directly and bring them to Copenhagen and parade them around in a similar colonial manner as we also see the Spanish and the French and the English doing it with both humans and artifacts and foods and whatever from the New World. So the Danes are behaving exactly like any other European colonial power at the time. And it has been theorized that part of those kidnappings was also because they were assumed, the Inuit were assumed to be responsible for the disappearance of the old settlers. So what Nordvig here in his book is actually doing here is reviving a 17th century theory on evil savages killing off European populations, settler populations, which is part of the general negative narrative about indigenous peoples that Europeans would be producing at the time and later on as well. That's why I'm not particularly fond of his book. Aside from the fact that it's based off of poor sources. Now in 1721, as I mentioned, we have the Danish Norwegian missionary Hans Egede convincing the Danish king to support a missionary expedition with Galactic Nomad to bring the Reformation to the old settlers. This is curious because already 100 years earlier, the Danish royal authorities had established that the Scandinavians aren't there. But this missionary, Hans Egede, uses this in his letter to the king, the notion that, well, if there are Scandinavians up there, they're still Catholics, so they need to be converted to Protestantism. He uses this as an argument for going there. And obviously he never finds any of the old settlers, but investigates the old settlements and then proceeds with his ulterior motive. And this is probably his real reason for going there in the first place, and that is to establish an Arctic Trade Company, the Royal Greenland Trade Department, which then establishes colonies along the coast, and these colonies become the modern day towns that we know today. So he founds Gottorp, which is now Nuuk, and the intention of these trade stations was to send fur and whale blubber to Denmark. The trade stations were generally self-reliant and received only 1 or 2 supply ships a year from Denmark. Now, the arrival of Egede then heralded the era of colonization proper, as in modern terms, colonization. And we then have the establishment of trade stations close to Inuit settlements, and then Inuit becoming increasingly dependent upon European trade goods such as coffee, sugar, and guns. Inuit would trade skin and blubber for these goods, and this trade interfered with their harvesting and increased their vulnerability to economic and climatic fluctuations. And that's where we then see also the generating this image of the poor Greenlandic Inuit that still is part of the general Danish racism. Let's just call it what it is, racism about Inuit today. Inuits there are plenty of prejudice against Inuits in Denmark still today, and phrasings that have been worked into the language that Danes will just blurt out without even thinking about it, which are inherently racist terms and racist ways of speaking about the Galactic. So that's part of that heritage that's still there. Now, some perhaps more positive aspects of the Danish colonization. What we see is that Galactic was to some extent spared from the most heinous colonial crimes. There was no attempted genocide, and racial hierarchies were not really formalized. There was a ban on intermarriage from the 1740s to 50s. But this was abandoned pretty quickly, and then there was a law instated instead for how marriages worked formally. The Dano-Norwegian colonial power sought to civilize and Christianize Inuit rather than open the land up to migrants. Greenland was under monopoly until 1953 proper. In the 1910s, I think, we see the opening of a fishing port for the Faroes. But aside from that, Greenland is sort of considered, it's a landmass that needs to be protected from the outside, the population and the landmass. And that's sort of like this very paternalistic approach that the Danes have applied in that context. We'll see more examples of that in a minute. Now, the result of the integration of Inuit into the Danish colonial system was an educated elite that in the last half of the 19th century was largely in charge of preserving Inuit culture. Remember, there were native councils and also later on democratic elected bodies that were governed by a Inuit mixed with Danish elite. Now, of course, they were preserving Inuit culture, and this was not without integrating colonial practices, but nonetheless more with some say in cultural and economic developments. And already in 1861, Greenland has its own newspaper and publishing house in the Western Greenlandic dialect, Kalaallisut. So that's part of the preservation of culture and language that also happens in this period of time. And this directly reflects the Danish approach to culture and language as a part of identity that we also see in Iceland. There's a reason that Iceland nowadays has a very strong individual Icelandic culture. That's because the Danish colonial government was not in the same way bent on destroying or erasing these indigenous cultures that it was interacting with, at least not at the same level as we see with other colonial powers. So most of the traditional cultural material has been written down and recorded by local schoolmasters and individuals with Inuit heritage, such as the explorer Knud Rasmussen, as we're seeing him right here. Knud Rasmussen lived from 1879 to 1933 and was born in Ilulissat to a missionary named Christian Rasmussen and his wife Sophie. Now, Sophie was of partial Inuit descent herself, and Rasmussen grew up in Ilulissat and learned traditional subsistence skills. He was well versed in dog sled, hunting on the ice, and all of these things. And he used these abilities to go and connect with the Inuit population in the far north that in the 1910s, I think, the early 1900s, he interacts with them. And this is apparently the first interaction with white people that they have in at least modern times. Now, he eventually became the most prominent ethnographer of Kalaallit Nunaat and Nunavut to some extent. He made an expedition to the Barren Grounds that was very successful too. However, his views on Inuit culture did not represent an indigenous perspective. He was very much a proponent of Western cultural superiority. And when you, for instance, if you ever pick up his Peoples of the Polar North, which is in many ways a very good book on the culture, you'll find that he represents Inuit culture as something that is dying out and even needs to die to an extent. And that's again this colonial paternalistic approach. So what happens in modern times? Well, we have a modernization and a Danification process that begins with 1953, where Kalaallit Nunaat is included into the Danish realm as an amt, which literally means county. And this was to avoid, as I mentioned, the abolishing of the country as a colony. And as Kalaallit Nunaat was included into the Danish realm as a county, the Danish government also decided that it needed to modernize to the same level as the rest of Denmark. So again, this paternalistic approach to Greenland, we know best, so to speak. Now, the Danification process from 53 to 75 in particular highlighted the need for Inuit self-determination in Galashdunad, and from 75, that's where we start seeing the call for independence. You could say that the modernization process was perhaps well meant, but it was ultimately misguided and a disaster. It resulted in a massive influx of Danes, the deprioritization of Galashdunad in the schools. Remember that this was an established language at the time that everybody would speak. A Danish language-based administrative system instead of a Galashdunad administrative system. Favoritism of Danish workers over Inuit workers, the so-called fødestedskriterium, which basically means that where you're born is the criteria for if you whether or not you get hired or what wages you're making, and that of course favorizes the Danes over the Inuit. The social and cultural consequences for Inuit were severe, with heightened rates of suicide, violence, and alcoholism as a result. And this led to massive resentment among Inuit who demanded sovereignty. The call for home rule in the early 70s was met with acceptance from the Danish government, was not met with respect in the Danish population in Galashdunad. And this is a quote from my former headmaster, who is still headmaster of the school, when I went there. He said, "This call for home rule is comparable to a teenager who revolts against their parents when they come of age." Now there you have it. It's a very paternalistic, very condescending attitude to Inuit, and this is what still sticks today in the relationship between Danes and Greenlanders. So with home rule that was granted in '79, we also see the establishment of a national Greenlandic democratic system, Naalakkesuisut and Inatsisartut. And these bodies are parliamentary bodies, just like we see in other Western democracies. And then we have different political parties emerging. We have Siumut, which is sort of the Galashdunad version of the Social Democrats, the biggest party in Denmark. Then we have Inuit Ataqatigiit, which are Inuit socialists, and then we have Attasut, which are conservatives, and they are typically the ones against formalizing an independent Greenland. And what you're seeing here are images from Nuuk. Then more parties have been formed since the 2000s. We have Galashdunad Demokratit, which is a social liberal party, Parti Inuit, which are Inuit nationalists, and then we also have Parti Nalaq, which is also an Inuit nationalist party. And they function in a similar way as the Danish democratic system, where you have multiple parties in the parliament who then agree on establishing a government based on the mandates that they get for collaboration. Now, what does Galashdunad look like today, and what is the situation? Well, the home rule government is probably defined as a process. Galashdunad signed a new treaty, as I mentioned, with Denmark in 2009 that gives them selvstyre, which literally means self-rule. This means that Greenland, the Greenlandic government, or Greenland governs itself, except for in foreign affairs. Galashdunad has self-determination when it comes to internal affairs and resources, but is still dependent on Denmark for international treaties and agreements. And this treaty also stipulates that Galashdunad may leave the Danish Commonwealth at any time. It's basically that part of the treaty is a copy of the treaty with Iceland that was given in 1918, where Iceland had a period of time, I think it was 25 years, of self-rule with Denmark in a commonwealth, and then they had the possibility of renegotiating the treaty or leaving the commonwealth, and they decided to leave. So we'll see what happens with Galashdunad. However, all of this is dependent on the financial situation of the country itself. What we're seeing is that Greenland currently receives subsidies that amounts to 46% of their GDP from the Danish government. That means that Greenland is not self-sustainable. And just to give you an idea of how these things are talked about in Denmark. Here we have a quote from Marlene Vind, a scholar of Greenlandic affairs, professor of Greenlandic affairs in Denmark, who was quoted in Danish media saying in 2018, she said, and she's referring to the sort of like the official approach of the Danish government. They, that would be Greenland and the Faroe Islands, are very poor and we don't give a shit about them. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. That's actually what she said. We just don't care very much about their call for independence. If they want independence, they can have it, but they won't leave. Nobody believes it. They get so much money from Denmark, and if they ever left, they'd go straight to the gutter. That's the that's a professor talking straight out of the bag. She was punished for this comment. There was a official investigation from the University of Copenhagen, I think. Yeah, she had to retract this statement, but it's true. This is how the Danish government has approached the relationship to Greenland up until very recently. I just want to give you a brief overview of a Danish language explainer video on the national Danish TV broadcast, DR. It's about 15 minutes. If any of you know any Danish or want to try to go through it, you're welcome to do so. The explainer is called, there's a link to it in the bottom, Why Does Greenland Want Independence? And what it tells us is one thing that, first of all, in 2019, we have a survey that demonstrates that 70.1% of all adults in Galashiq want independence. And, quote, sometime in the future. Now, only 39.9% would vote yes if there was a referendum right now. And some of the quotes that come from this short documentary, whatever you want to call it, by people in Greenland. We have one saying, we must have independence. We can be friends, but we are the ones that must decide things up here. Or, it is time that we take control of the things that need to happen here. Or, why would we not have independence? I think it's an old-fashioned idea to keep the so-called commonwealth in the way that it is defined today. And another one, I want independence for Galashiq so that we can have control over our own country, our resources, our people, but also our culture and how we develop our country in the future. And then this one is saying, I think, that the relationship and the feelings that are involved here. We've been treated as the child that needs to shut up and let the grown-ups do the work. And the grown-ups in this context are Denmark and the United States in particular. And then as someone else said, any people wants 100% self-determination. On the right-hand side of the screen, we have a picture of a very recent events in the wake of the BLM protests and toppling of statues in the US and then in the UK and elsewhere in Europe. We also had a defacing or whatever you want to call this of the statue of the missionary Hans Egede that is situated in the center of Nuuk. And what you're seeing here is red paint, obviously. Aside from that, the word decolonized written on the side. And then also markings that are known from traditional Inuit tattooing. And obviously, that is a part of the sentiment that exists in Greenland today. There was very recently a local referendum in Nuuk about taking down that statue where people decided to keep it up. So that's also interesting. If you're more interested in reading more about this and also relationships between Greenlanders and Danes in different ways, you're welcome to go to my website, nordicmythology.com, nordicmythologychannel.com, sorry, and take a look at this blog post I've written about, well, it's called Something About Vikings in Greenland, and other thoughts I have about Galashiq, Denmark, and the North Atlantic, and just stop saying Eskimo, please. So yeah, you can go read that one. That tells you a little bit about the cultural relationships that exist, and also the cross-cultural relationships that you find in individuals like myself. who would be properly known as Greenlanders in terms of like the old Scandinavian settlers rather than the modern ones. Okay, so a little final thing here. What happened next in this relationship is, well, this guy, President Trump, eyes a new real estate purchase, Greenland. And this did not go over well. His attempt at buying Greenland last year, the Danish Prime Minister, as you're seeing here, Mette Frederiksen, basically said that's absurd, and that offended him. But what all of this has amounted to is a conversation about how, well, about Greenland and the Arctic in general, and all of a sudden the Danish government is realizing that it actually needs to step up its game in terms of making Greenland feel respected and welcome in the Commonwealth in Denmark. Because the result of all of this was the establishment of a consulate in Nuuk. There's not been a consulate in Nuuk, a U.S. consulate in Nuuk since the 1950s. And now, all of a sudden, the U.S. has a representation that can talk directly with the Greenlandic government without having to go through the Danish government, which is otherwise the formal process. We're seeing a headline right here from Denmark: the Arctic can become the new Middle East. And this is a concerning issue at the moment. We're also seeing the Icelanders saying a typical Icelandic thing, you know, these typical statements without any thought to what kind of sentiments it might bring to the table. Iceland's president has basically called the Arctic a new Africa. And what does that mean? Well, it means that everybody's scrambling for the resources that you can get up there. And that, of course, compromises the safety and security of Greenland as a nation, the Danish Commonwealth, Norway for that matter, multiple Arctic nations. To give you a brief recap of the American involvement in galactic Greenland, we have first in 1867 a report on buying Greenland. Then in 1910, a suggestion to trade Mindanao for galactic Greenland and the Danish West Indies. Denmark did sell their colonies, old slave colonies in the West Indies to the United States. They're now called the U.S. Virgin Islands. They used to be the Danish Virgin Islands. In 1943, we had the establishment of the Thule Air Base and multiple other air bases just prior to that. Then we have in 1946, the U.S. offered what is in current money, $1 billion for Greenland. In 1949, we had the expansion of the Thule Air Base with the NATO treaty. Denmark was one of the original signers of the NATO treaty, obviously because of Greenland. In 1962, we have a B-52 crash with 4 hydrogen bombs in Thule, which spread radioactive material. This was something that only came, that the Greenlandic government only realized later on. And nobody knew that the Danish government had allowed nuclear weapons in Greenland at this time. And this is still a matter for the Greenlandic government. They are still incredibly offended by this, because once again, this is sort of like, as if we go back to that quote before, the grown-ups are doing the talking, and the child, Greenland, just needs to shut up in that context. That's very much how it feels to the galactic. And then we have the Trump offer to buying galactic Greenland, and he even in that context floated the idea of trading it for Puerto Rico. So keep that in mind. And why? Well, here's the last slide for this presentation. We have an overview of this minerals that have been identified in the Greenlandic underground. Actually, the Greenlandic underground seems to be very rich in minerals, and this is, of course, one of the reasons that the U.S. government is so interested in the country. Aside from that, it is also, well, it owns a lot of the the ocean territory that would be involved in a northwest passage between the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. So that brings us to the geopolitical relevance of Greenland today, and why the old cultural and historical relationships between Greenland and Denmark are relevant for this whole context. Denmark officially decides who Greenland makes decisions with, but the current situation is actually that the American government is curbing that to an extent, and along with the consulate in Nuuk also came, I think it was about $12 million for infrastructure in Greenland. The primary problem with extracting minerals in the Greenlandic underground is infrastructure, the availability of electricity. Once again, consider the size of this country compared to its population size and the almost complete lack of roads. There are no towns in Greenland that are connected by roads. So you basically have a huge infrastructural problem when it comes to building mines and so on. So since what the situation is now, that the only reason that Greenland is not an independent country is that they can't afford to be an independent country with the same living standards that they have them right now. They're basically held in this gridlock by Denmark, and they will need billions to become independent. And those billions are available in the underground as minerals, but they're hard to extract, and it will take years and years and years. And that's why you get this percentage in the survey I mentioned before. 70% want independence, but only 39% want it now. And I will end my little lecture here, and if you have any questions, you're welcome to ask.
Okay, well, thanks, Mathias. We're kind of against our hour here, so a lot of people may leave here, but I'm sure that if others have questions, or people have questions here, that Mathias would be glad to stay on for a while and address these. But this is a fascinating talk, right? Rather different than a lot of the talks we get, and it's a great change. I think it's really a great change, and it really shows you how relevant the stuff is that we do here at NSIDC. So thank you again, Mathias. For those of you who need to leave, that's fine, I understand. But if others have questions, I'm sure Mathias would be happy to answer them. So,
absolutely, thank you.
There was one question in the chat, and that was when you were talking about the kidnappings. Siri Joda asked, has genetic testing shed any light on the history of settlers in Greenland? I think that when you were talking about the disappearance of the communities, and then...
Yeah, so this is a little difficult. I'm not entirely sure. So right now, one of the world experts on genetics is actually at the University of Copenhagen National Museum in Copenhagen. Eske Willerslev. He's doing a lot of research on this, and I'm not sure what they've actually found on Greenland, except for what we already know, and that is that 80% of all Galashlid in Greenland share genetics with Europeans. I actually, in my blog post, I did write something about this, but I'm also incredibly bad at remembering numbers. That's why I became a literature and culture major. But yeah, we're dealing with, this concept of genetically pure is something that rubs against me, but there's hardly anybody who's like genetically pure in modern Greenland today. You're getting another one. The grave sites.
Other questions?
Yes, there are. We do have grave sites, and I'm sure that they are doing testing on them. already, but I can't give you any proper information on that right now. But I can probably dig out some articles on it.
Hey, Matthias, thanks. That was a great talk. I'm wondering, it seems like right now they're sort of stuck where they can't have independence because they can't afford it. The other option is to sell mineral rights, and then that would just be potentially an environmental disaster as well. So is there a way out? Is there some other way they can go?
I mean, yeah, there is a way out, but that one depends on the Danish government. So back in the early 10s, I think it was in 2013 or 12, the Greenlandic government set down a peace and reconciliation commission, similar to the one after apartheid in South Africa. It basically modeled over the same concept. And this was, if you ask me, an incredibly generous approach of the Greenlandic government to if you consider the emotions that the average Galashlid holds when it comes to the relationship to Danes. They feel treated as inferior. They feel disrespected to an extent that is incredibly hard to imagine if you haven't experienced it. And then they sit down this commission to sort out that relationship and to ask the Danes for some form of reconciliation. And the Danish prime minister at the time, Helle Thorning-Schmidt, responded with, "Oh, we don't need that. We have no interest in that." So this is probably where everybody needs to start, if you ask me. You need to start with the reconciliation, Danish recognition of the atrocities, even if the Danes can refer to, well, we never committed genocide, we sort of kept the language and culture alive to some extent, and so on and so on. They still need to go through this process, and if they start there, that might actually help to some extent. And then, of course, as we're also seeing in that short documentary I referred to before, a lot of them say, well, okay, so they're paying for half of our GDP, but this comes with strings attached. You need to show that you're grateful. You need to show that you need to basically submit, right? And that's true. That is the expectation from the Danish government. No, being treated as the treaty from 2009 also stipulates, being treated as an equal partner, an actual equal partner, would be, if you ask me, the best solution for Greenland. Because geopolitically, I mean, I think we're all aware that the US does not have a good track record when it comes to treating indigenous peoples. And especially if there's a lot of resources involved, then you see an environmental and also population disaster in the wake. And that would be completely disastrous. And now what we're seeing is that the Inuit nationalist parties, especially the previous foreign minister or minister in charge of foreign affairs, or whatever you want to call it. He's not an actual foreign minister in Greenland, because the Danish foreign minister is the foreign minister for Greenland. But Vitus Hoyapitsok, he was all up in, yeah, awesome. The Americans are going to save us from the Danes. Yeah, I don't think so, my friend. Especially not this administration. They're in it for the money. And so Greenland is stuck in that bind. If Greenland just decides to cut loose from Denmark now, it's going to be gobbled up by the US, probably. There's a small risk of straight up invasion from Russia. But the US will probably take it over simply. This is also what we know from internal sources in the current administration. They consider Greenland rightfully American territory.
All right. Well, I think we're going to have to kind of end it here. We're kind of over here, but I'm sure we've got your contact, Matthias. So I'm sure obviously this has generated a lot of interest in our center. This is good stuff, and it just puts things in perspective, in terms of what we do. And so I'm hoping that we can have some continued collaborations with NSIDC, because I think you bring a very key perspective. So I think with that, maybe we can just have a virtual round of applause for Matthias.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'll end it here, and thank you very much. This was great.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.